All right, this is section 3 of chapter 6, and the topic is market failure. In the last video I asked you, is it good in a market capitalist society for individuals and firms to have the freedom to maximize their objectives? And we saw under some circumstances it is. Efficiency, at least, is maximized when individuals pursue their own self-interest. This is Adam Smith's invisible hand at work, guiding people as if through an invisible hand to the most efficient outcome for society as a whole. But we also mentioned there are some situations where markets left to themselves will not achieve efficiency. And this is called market failure. The failure of private decisions in the marketplace to achieve an efficient allocation of scarce resources. And so what are the reasons for market failure? There are several. One, if markets are not competitive. And this is called, sometimes in the extreme, a monopoly. You have one seller. What about if property rights are not well defined and fully transferable? We'll look at situations where this is the cause of market failure. And then we'll also look at external costs, also called externalities. So what's an externality? Well, it's when the action of one person negatively affects another person. So for example, if I'm driving my car and you're behind me riding your bicycle and my car coming out of my tailpipe is a bunch of pollution, that's an externality. And so if I'm maximizing my utility and I'm driving my car to do so, I don't take into account the fact that I'm creating all these negative externalities, then we might have an inefficient outcome. So these are all examples that can lead to markets to fail. We're going to talk after the midterm in a lot of detail about non-competitive markets, and in particular what happens when there's a monopoly. So let me just for now mention that can lead to inefficiency. That can lead to a deadweight loss. Turns out the monopolist will charge too high a price and won't produce enough. So a competitive market is better than a monopolistic market from the standpoint of efficiency. But another situation where markets fail to achieve efficiency is of public goods. And what's a public good? A good for which the cost of exclusion is prohibitive and for which the marginal cost of an additional user is zero. I want to put this a little bit differently for you. So public goods are non-excludable and non-rival. You won't find those terms in the book, but these are commonly used terms to describe public goods. So non-excludable means people can't be prevented from consuming them. Non-rival means when one person uses the good, it does not diminish another person's ability to use the good. So can you think of any examples of public goods? I think the best example is a radio signal that is broadcast through the spectrum. Think about it. If you tune your radio to 89.5, you can't be prevented from doing that, right? I mean, if I broadcast my signal over 89.5, I can't prevent any of you from tuning in if you're in the listening area, right? So in other words, that radio broadcast is non-excludable. But it's also non-rival. And this means if you listen to the radio station, it does not prevent you from also listening to it. So those are the two characteristics of public goods. But the reason that public goods lead to market failure is because of the non-excludability. And the question is about providing them. How will they be provided? That's the problem. Because if I can't prevent you from tuning into my radio station, how am I going to pay my bills? Well, you've listened to radio stations, so you know the answer to that. But I'm not charging radio stations don't charge you for listening, right? This is one of the innovations of satellite radio. If you don't pay the bill, the satellite radio provider can shut you off, right? Or same like cable. you don't pay your cable bill, you're not going to be able to watch it. So those are excludable. But what about television broadcasts through the spectrum? Those are non-excludable. So how do television stations make money? They've figured out a creative solution. They make you watch advertisements. So the problem with public goods is in providing them. How will they be provided? If you can't exclude people from using them, many people will decide to be free riders. And so if you listen to the radio station and don't pay for it, you're a free rider. Many radio stations get around this by selling ads, but there is at least one radio station that doesn't. Which is that? Which radio station does not sell ads? National Public Radio, NPR, the public radio channels. So how do they raise money? They have pledge drives, and they ask for donations. Do most people who watch that, who listen to that radio station, donate? Probably not. Just like PBS. When you watch Sesame Street when you were a kid, or maybe some of you still watch it, I don't know. From time to time they had pledge drives. Maybe some of you have seen this. If you donate $100, you get like a coffee cup or whatever. Right? But the point is that they want donations. But most people don't donate, so they're free riders. That's the problem. Because they're prohibited from selling advertisements, they have to raise money in other ways. Another example of a public good is national defense. If we have a strong army, then none of you have to worry about being invaded by the Canadians. So you're all enjoying the benefits of that, and you can't be excluded from enjoying the benefits. Right? The army is going to protect all of you, whether or not you pay for it. And so if we made paying for the benefits of the military voluntary, most of us would decide to be free riders. We would not pay. We would enjoy the benefits without having to pay for it. So how are armies paid for in the US and most other countries? Through taxation. The government forces you to pay your income taxes and then uses that money to fund the government. So the free rider problem is solved by governments. In other words, although Adam Smith was right to point out the benefits of free markets, that individuals left to themselves with no high-level coordination, in other words, independently, can result in an efficient allocation of resources for society as a whole. But not in all cases. And so in some cases, we do need the government. Or another clever solution can be found to provide public goods. And so sometimes that's government supply, and sometimes not. Now it's important to keep in mind, and this is a heads up, in the textbook, the definition of public goods are based on the characteristic of the goods, not whether they're provided by the public or the private sector. For example, postal services are a private good. Private goods are excludable and rival. And so, is a postal service excludable? Yes. If you don't pay for your stamp, they're not going to deliver your mail. Is it rival? Yes, because delivering your letter means the post office can't simultaneously deliver someone else's letter. In other words, delivering letters takes time away from them for what they could be doing other things. So postal service is excludable and rival. It's a private good. The fact that it's provided by the government doesn't make it public. And in fact, some private goods, some goods that are provided by private or nonprofit organizations are in fact public goods, like radio broadcasting, television programming. Or even if you have somebody who plays music on the street, that can be considered a public good, and they play for donations. So public goods, sometimes they're provided by governments, sometimes not. And this figure here, just to conclude the discussion about public goods, shows how you can use demand and supply to illustrate the inefficiency associated with the free rider problem. So the efficient quantity would be Q star, but because of the free rider problem, we only have the smaller quantity. The purple area is the deadweight loss. Total surplus, consumer surplus plus producer surplus, would be higher if we exchanged Q star. But we're only exchanging Q1, so we have a big deadweight loss. So that's the free rider problem. It's associated with public goods. More generally, it's associated with all non-excludable goods. And it's problem with providing them in the first place. Now, what about external costs and benefits? I use that example of tailpipe emissions to illustrate an external cost. So you're driving down the road, and while you're doing that, you're polluting. The bicycle riders who are behind you are breathing in that pollution, and that's increasing their chance of dying, right? Decreasing their health, and also just decreasing their enjoyment generally, because they would prefer to breathe clean air rather than pollution from the cars. And so if you think about every gallon of gasoline that is burned has an external cost associated with it, say of this amount, then the marginal cost curve, in fact, is higher. Producing, say this is Q, P, this is a quantity of gasoline consumed. Consuming that quantity doesn't only cost what might be the cost of buying the gasoline, but you have to also add in that external cost, so that the true social cost of burning a gallon of gasoline is higher. And so if we don't take into account the social costs, then society will wind up here. But the true costs are here. So these are the total costs associated with that quantity. This area here, these are the total costs, and these are the total benefits. So notice this is the area of net benefits. However, this is a negative benefit, right? The costs are higher than the benefits here. So this purple area turns out to be the deadweight loss. So just like there's a case for government intervention with respect to public goods, right? Forcing people to pay a tax in order to provide them, there also is a case for government intervention in the context of external costs. And so, for example, we can require people to have their car checked periodically to make sure it's not polluting too much. And so most of you have had your car smogged, right? That's what we call it in California. We can charge taxes. When you go to buy gasoline, you pay a tax for every gallon you buy. And the idea is to make private individuals face the true social cost of consuming gasoline, in this example. If so, if we say make them pay a tax equal to the true social cost, this true external cost, then they will decide to consume. The market will exchange this quantity. This will be the price. This will be consumer surplus. And this will be producer surplus. And the external costs will all be accounted for. Finally, there's something called common property resources. And these are similar to public goods in one sense. So I would like to draw a figure for you that describes 4 different types of goods. So a good can be excludable or not. So it can be excludable yes or excludable no. And it can also be rival. Yes or no. And so if a good is excludable and rival, we're in this area. What do we call that type of good? Private good. What if it's non-rival and non-excludable, so that we're down here? Then that is a public good. If it's non-excludable and rival, then this is what we call a common property resource. And so a common property resource is, for example, like a public park. No one can be excluded from using the public park. But if you go to the park and put your blanket down, then no one else can use that space. So it's rival, right? And so, or think about going to a San Jose State Spartan tailgate game. No one can be prevented from using that parking lot, but when you use it, you take up the space for someone else to use. And so a problem associated with common property resources, first of all, the problem is in providing them because of the free rider problem. So notice this is also, like public goods, non-excludable. That means there's a free rider problem and they're difficult to provide. But there's a separate problem with common pool resources, also common pool resources or common property resources. The separate problem with CPRs that doesn't exist with public goods is here there's a tendency for overuse. Because it's free to use, people overuse it. And this leads to something called a tragedy of the commons. And although when we defined economics at the beginning of this course, we said economics is about allocating scarce resources efficiently. That's true. But a lot of what economists do involves figuring out creative solutions to the tragedy of the commons and free rider problem. And so yes, this has to do with allocating scarce resources, but it's less a mechanical or mathematical problem sometimes. And sometimes it involves being creative. For example, figuring out that you can sell advertisements in order to fund your radio broadcast. And common property resources, some societies have figured out ways, like social norms, that prevent people from overusing parks, right? For example, if someone is littering in the park, maybe you give them a dirty look, and that social pressure usually seems to be enough to keep people from overusing, in other words, from societies falling into the tragedy of the commons. But not always. And so these are really interesting questions that have to do with many of the public policy situations that we hear about in the news on a daily basis. So some of you notice there's a blank box here. Indeed, we refer to these goods that are excludable but non-rival as club goods. And so, for example, let's say you have a really big swimming pool, or maybe a golf course. If you own it, then you can prevent people from using it. In other words, it's excludable. But if it's such a big golf course or such a big pool that there's never congestion, then it's non-rival. And so that's called a club good. We're probably not going to be dealing with club goods, but it certainly is another type of good that economists have analyzed.